There was a song in the 80s with a lyric that said, "It's the last piece of the puzzle and you just can't make it fit." And I was reminded of that as I was working on this passage today. It's the last passage, not only in this chapter that we've been in, chapter 10 for a while, but really this whole section that we've been going with. And but I looked, and how does it fit? How does this one here, what is it that this passage adds? And so, what have we seen so far? We've been looking at really all the way back to the Transfiguration. You could go back to chapter 8, and we've been seeing this idea, and even before that really, we've been seeing this idea of humility. And true humility, not just, I don't brag, but humility in the sense of aware of my limitations. God is God and I'm not. And then also that other side of putting the interest of others ahead of me. We've seen this, I would say, going back to certainly the confession, what we call Peter's good confession, you are the Christ. And then right after it, though, you remember what Peter does when Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. You're like, no, you're not. The total lack of humility. You are the Christ, the special one from God, but I can tell you you're wrong. I know more than you do. Then it goes on, and then where the Transfiguration comes in, and I think it was God's way of reminding them. It's like, listen, this person who has been with you, don't lose sight of the fact. Even though you've hung around him, I'm sure they joked around some. Do you ever think about that? Jesus and the disciples just joking around? I'm sure they did that. They were friends. But the Transfiguration was God's way of saying, don't forget who he is. They didn't even fully realize at that point. But don't forget, he's not just a guy. He's not even just a prophet, not just the Messiah. There is something about him. Have that humility when it comes to that. And then you remember they come down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and what had happened? The other disciples had been unable to cast out a demon. And it says in that passage that they were arguing with the scribes. And I got the impression that they had cast out demons before, and so here comes this father with his son. Hey, can you heal my son? Why, sure. Demon, hit the road. And then they're back to arguing, and wait, he didn't leave. And they lost sight of the humility that power that they have comes from God. It's not something just to take for granted. You keep going on in what we saw there, and then they ask this question, who is the greatest? And that betrays both elements of humility, the putting others first, but also just their awareness of their limitations. They think they know how the kingdom works. They've got this physical mindset, and so it makes total sense. Who's the greatest? Who's going to be the top guy, and below that, right under Jesus? And their mindset betrays true humility. It doesn't have that. They talk about divorce after that. Jesus gives that teaching, and even there's the idea of not realizing our limitations, of just forgetting what God said about, what God has joined together, let no man put apart. And certainly the idea in that culture of how much a woman would be harmed, and so not putting others first. Everything we've seen, it continues this idea of humility. The disciples tell the children, hey, get lost. Jesus is too busy for you. One, they assume they know what the true priorities are, and two, they definitely aren't putting them first. The children, they don't deserve that. The rich young man comes to Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he just assumes, and you see it afterward in the disciples, they just assume we know God's mind. We know how this kingdom stuff works, and they're so wrong. They're so off. They don't have the humility. They don't know what they don't know about what they don't know. And then even after that, the last thing we saw before this passage today is the request of James and John. What do they say? Hey, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand? So once again, not putting others first. You see the effect of that. The others become angry at them. But also just assuming we know what this kingdom's going to be like, despite everything Jesus has said, everything he's done, his focus on the spiritual the entire time, and even going back into the Old Testament, things they've missed, they don't get any of that. So we've seen humility played out quite a bit. What does this passage today add? We're going to see the healing of the blind man, blind Bartimaeus. You might remember that story before we even look at it. How does it fit with what we've seen so far? It's clearly the end of this section. Chapter 11 starts Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem for the last week of his life. This is the end. It's part of it. But what does it tell us about humility? What does it add? Why did Mark and why did God want Mark to include this story? What's it tell us the others didn't? And of course, the ultimate question then is, what's the lesson? What are we as followers of Christ to get from this passage today? And so, to figure that out, I've told you many times that, not just to find out the meaning of a certain maybe verse, but to find out what's the lesson of a passage, you interpret the less clear things about it by the clear things. And so that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to start with what's clear, and we're going to work through this together. So I hope you're ready to put on your thinking caps and put on your speaking, whatever that is, because I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. We're going to figure out, why is this here? What's the purpose of it? So Mark chapter 10, let's look at this account starting at verse 46. It says, they came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. All right, so our approach here is what is clear in this passage. And by that, I don't mean what clearly happened. Jesus healed a blind man. We know that. How's it fit? To that, we need to dig a little deeper. What's the clear focal point of this passage? What is, and I often tell you to look for, especially in a narrative passage like this, a story versus an epistle, what's the wait a minute moment? And sometimes the problem we have is because we're familiar with the passage and we know what happens, there's no wait a minute sensation to us because it's not new, it's not a surprise. But I want us to try to stand back. What is it that stands out about this passage that should cause us to say, hey, wait a minute, why that there? So let's work our way through this and begin to see what's happening. It says there that Jesus, as he was leaving Jericho, remember, where is Jesus going? Jerusalem, exactly. And when is it in the time frame of the year? It's spring. It's coming up on what Jewish holiday? Passover, the big holiday that represents the exodus of the Israelites out of bondage in Egypt. And so you could see, what bondage are they under at this time? Rome, the Roman oppression, and they were waiting to be free from it. And they were hoping the Messiah would come. And you certainly get the mood. What's happening here? That phrase, Son of David, that's used. For the blind man to use that, you assume that maybe he'd been hearing that. The crowd all around him is talking about Son of David, which would mean they're talking about the Messiah. The people, Jesus is leaving Jericho. He's 15 miles away from Jerusalem. He's clearly has it's grown, this messianic expectation. This, if not could be, is him, certainly could be the Messiah. He's headed to Jerusalem. Everyone knows that. He's been on his way. Passover is coming up. This could be it. We've waited hundreds, thousands of years. This could be it. The Messiah coming. Well, and then you have this blind man. What are the implications of being blind in that culture at that time? Lonely? Couldn't support yourself. There's one thing. This was before the, People with Disabilities Act and things, will try to make life easier. And they couldn't support themselves, couldn't get around. Well, matter of fact, what's he called there? He's a blind beggar. That's how he made his living, was to beg from people. And think of what that was like for him. It shows later when, Jesus calls to him, it says he sprang up. What's that tell you about him? He was agile. He was young. I don't know if I spring up too much anymore. So, this guy still would have been able, if he wasn't blind, he could support himself. But because of that, his whole life is dependent on others. And just imagine what that would do to you. And here is Jesus. And so he calls out to Jesus. He's no doubt heard about him. Jesus is famous, well known. He is able to heal all kinds of illnesses. Certainly Jesus can heal him. And so the blind man calls out to him. And how did some of the people respond? Sir. Yeah, sit down and shut up. That's what they tell him. Well, and then Jesus responds, what's he say?
Call him.
Call him. Then how did the people change after that? I thought this was interesting. And you got to read into the, just the word, but take heart, get up, he's calling you. It's like now they're, hey, here he is. Yeah, come on, Jesus, here's the guy. And we're saying, sit down and shut up. But then when Jesus says, call him, oh, okay, Jesus, here he is. Yeah, right here, just like you wanted. Changes their tone a little bit there. Jesus asked the man then, what do you want me to do for you? Why do you think Jesus asked that? I think he did. There's a time where Jesus asks a man who's lame, he says, do you want to be healed? And you would think, well, of course. And I think the point there in that passage in John is, do you want the implications of, if you're healed, then you now have to provide for yourself and live on your own. Do you want the implications of that? I think it's here, he's pointing out, he's sort of reminding the crowd, what is it this man wants? And he asked him, I want to be able to see. I just want to be able to see. And again, in their culture, they know what it means not to see. Everything, the ways that it has impacted his life. And then Jesus heals him. He says, your faith has made you well. This man calling out, the faith of not only believing, but acting on in accordance with that belief, calling out, persevering as he calls out, springing up, excited to know, I'm going to be healed. Well, you look at that. Did you get a wait a minute moment from this passage? Is there anything that said, wait a minute, what? Why? What stands out to you about this passage?
What did he want to see?
What's that?
What did he want to see?
What did who want to see?
The blind man.
The blind man. What did he want to see? So you're asking, what do you want? What else stands out to you? Jesus pays attention to all. Okay. What's as opposed to? The crowd ignoring the blind man. Think about that. These people try to prevent a blind man from being healed. They try to prevent a blind man from being... How long did it take Jesus to heal him? Second. Yeah, they tried to prevent him. And so what question, to me, does that not only raise, but it demands? I would say the question to think about, the wait a minute moment, is what would make people think it's okay to try and stop a blind man from being healed? What would be in your mind to say, as this blind man, Jesus, please, and say, sit down and shut up? Why would someone think that's okay? What is it about them that would lead to that, and it would be all right? And I think you need to ask maybe why they did it to get to this, all right, what is it that makes them think it's okay? Why do you think that's the approach they took?
Doesn't affect me.
Doesn't affect me. I think that's one thing. And, doesn't affect me personally, or you certainly get the impression. Do you think his mother was in the crowd saying, sit down and shut up, or his brother, or anyone who cared about him? Yeah, it doesn't seem like anyone there had a personal connection to him. What else would be a reason they would say, sit down and shut up? They try to keep a blind man from being healed.
Takes attention away from them.
Takes the attention away from them, and what is their attention on?
Healing, touching him.
On what are the people, that's what is going to happen. What are they focused on right now as Jesus is headed to Jerusalem?
A kingdom.
A kingdom. Yeah, I think that's the attention. I think you're right. It's the attention off of them. We want to see him get to Jerusalem. We don't care it takes a few seconds. This could be the Messiah headed to Jerusalem. And then maybe what's another reason?
They didn't recognize Jesus.
They certainly don't, as they're thinking about the Messiah. I think, what have we seen over and over up to this point? What has Jesus done over and over?
Rewarded faith.
He's rewarded faith in the sense of he's healed people. You ever think, especially again, if you've got no personal connection, and hey, we want to see what happens in Jerusalem, what's another blind man being healed? We've seen that. That's old hat now. I mean, for a while it was pretty exciting, but whatever. You know, we've seen the blind man. Let's get on to something else. That's old hat. We've seen it. And so if you had to summarize all those, what's the reason why? Huh? Yeah, it's what the blind man had. Their reasons, if you had to take, they'd seen it before, they had no personal connection, and they wanted to see what happens when Jesus gets to Jerusalem. There's no personal benefit to them. Doesn't do anything. I've seen blind people be healed and know Jesus can do it. That's not even a challenge for him. Don't know this guy. You know, he's not like he's my brother and I got to take care of him or want him to be better. And we're waiting for the Messiah. Well, that's pretty callous, though. I don't think anyone's going to ever admit, like, okay, why do we say it? Because we really don't care about him. You know, human nature likes to protect our, our motives, doesn't it? Likes to put a spin on things. So how could you rationalize this? You know, here's Jesus, here's you. How do you, like, I'm okay. It's okay that I say, sit down and shut up to this blind man, because how do you weigh things? Got more important things. This is Jesus. Every indication is he's the Messiah. We have been waiting thousands of years for the Messiah. We've been waiting, definitely decades to get free of different oppressions. The Romans are here. We want them out. It's Passover. This, what's the fate of one person, the life of one person compared to what we're focused on here? I think that's what's going through their mind. I think that's what this passage adds as you look at it here. And so, once again, what would make people think it's okay to try and stop a blind man from being healed? We've got bigger and better things to do. And ultimately, what's below all that? What's beneath that? What's the root issue? It's that same pride and lack of humility. The same lack of humility, certainly not putting others first. Here's this guy. He's blind. He can be healed like that. Sit down and shut up. And even the other side of aware of my limitations, to think it's okay if we tell him that. There's bigger things. Well, they're not aware of my limitation compared to God and his focus and his purpose. How important faith is and Jesus, who he is and what he came to do. They don't know what they don't know. They don't have that humility there regarding what's important in the nature of the kingdom. And so as we look at this, we see it yet again. We see this idea of humility, the two aspects, and what it leads to regarding God. If I don't have humility regarding God, aware of my limitations, I'm not going to worship him truly. Because what's worship? It's to declare God's worth. Well, I've sort of either diminished his worth or I've increased my worth. There's not as big a gap between me and God, which is the essence of worship. God, you're so amazing. Yeah, well, God, you're pretty amazing, but I'm not all that bad. Well, I got this stuff pretty well figured out here. And then the other thing, what's a lack of humility do? Well, I don't show love to people the way I should. Don't put them first. Show that true love. Well, as you think about the way we interact with God and others, does that bring anything to mind? If you look on the handout, Matthew 22, Jesus is asked the question, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Jesus said these are the two biggest. Love the Lord your God, love your neighbor. Is it sinking in how serious pride is? How serious a lack of true humility is? We've seen it for so long. We're seeing how it ties in with what Jesus says. This is the most important. Everything that's been said, the whole Old Testament hangs on these two. And at the heart of them, it depends, am I doing it or not? It depends on, do I have humility or not? And the other thing that we've seen repeatedly when it comes to people not having humility, they don't realize it, do they? They don't know what they don't know. So humility is ultra important, and it's possible not to be aware that I don't have it. That's a dangerous combination, isn't it? A poison is deadly, and it's possible not to know if it's around your house. That's a bad thing. If there's a deadly poison, but I know it's nowhere near me, okay. If everything's near me and I know they're okay, that's all right. But a deadly poison near me and I don't know it, that's bad. Pride, lack of humility, so serious, and it's possible not to know it. And whenever we ask, we look at them, and we've seen the disciples especially. And haven't you been tempted to ask? When Jesus says, you still don't get it, guys? Haven't you been tempted to ask, how could they? How could they not understand what Jesus is saying? How could they not get it? Well, whenever we're tempted to ask that, the very next question needs to be, how could I miss it? If they could miss it, I could too. Am I missing it? Really needs to be the next question. How could they? Am I? Am I missing it too? And that's what I want us to look at. In what areas am I lacking humility? And those same two general categories. When it comes to being aware of my limitations regarding God, the general problem in Mark, and it's been the theme of the whole book, is, including the disciples, is they have this focus on the physical versus the spiritual. And they don't have the humility to realize it's wrong. They think, I've got this figured out. It is all about the physical kingdom and the physical Messiah and the physical miracles he does to people. That's what it's all about. And they miss the point. Well, the same thing with us, and it falls under those categories of physical versus spiritual. I put down a few examples. Am I missing out? Am I not aware of my limitations in sense of works and legalism versus faith and grace? That falls under those same categories. The physical focuses on works and legalism. The spiritual focuses on grace and faith. Am I missing it? It says in Galatians 1, 6-9, Paul writes, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say it again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. If anyone is indicating in any way that you earn salvation or earn God's favor by the things you do, or that you lose it, you're less secure in any sense by the things you do or don't do, Paul says, let that person be accursed. This is serious. It's eternally serious. Because our salvation is by grace through faith. And I'm not saying that we aren't saved if we throw some works mentality in because it plagues us. But Paul does say in Galatians, if you get to the total point where you just come out and say, God, judge me on my works, you don't want that. But for most of us, it's not that far. It's just that we bring it in some. Do you feel more secure in your relationship with God after you've done some good things versus maybe after you've let some words fly or gotten angry or these, and boy, I remember someone saying a while ago, I just hope Jesus doesn't come while that person's doing that thing. That's not how it works. We're not saved, lost, saved, lost, saved, lost. I'm saved by grace. For as long as I remain a Christian, I can turn my back on grace, but it doesn't go back and forth like that. And if I think it does, I've said before, we're going to have these two extremes. The one is pride. I think my salvation is in any way dependent upon my works, and I think I'm doing pretty well, better than most. Or I know I'm not doing well at all, and man, I feel terrible. We had a ministers' meeting this past week, and they had a counselor who was there doing the main presentation. And before we got together, they always have us pray on some area that's related. And one of the people in our group, he was a counselor. And one of the ministers asked him, what's the most common problem you see? And he said, shame. I said, yeah. I remember reading a book by a Christian counselor on grace that half my patients could go home in a week if they knew they were forgiven. And those are the people who go see him. The people with pride don't go see him. They think they got it all figured out. The people with shame, though, just feeling guilty about everything. Again, there's right and wrong, But my salvation isn't dependent on that in the terms of my forgiveness and my assurance. My transformation, yeah, I need to do more. What's right? Avoid what's wrong. But that doesn't impact whether I'm forgiven and going to heaven. Not directly. It's based on God's grace and my faith. Do I miss that? And that would be me thinking, I've got this whole kingdom thing all figured out, just as bad as the rich young ruler and the disciples and all of them. So that's one way. The other way is, am I missing this idea of what I know or don't know when it comes to physical objects and actions versus the underlying spiritual realities? This one came up in Sunday school. The verse in 1 Samuel says, "Has the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams." The New Testament verse that is similar says, "For no one is a Jew who is merely one outwardly, nor is circumcision outward and physical, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God." He's saying God's people is not determined by just the physical act, just doing that and not having the faith. And it's so easy to put our focus on the outer things. It's so easy. I know so many times I've struggled. Here I am trying to make videos for this ministry I have, and I get so upset when something doesn't go right, when the dogs are barking or someone walks across the top. Like, okay, I'm doing these physical things for God, and my heart is really messed up. But it's easy to get into that, to focus on those physical things that we do. It's easy as a church to focus on the physical things. We talked in Sunday school about the importance of communion, because it's, what Jesus did is the basis for why we're here. I also remember, the opposite extreme, and that's the problem. We all need to be in balance. We can forget about Jesus and how foundational that is, but I also know when I was on the traveling team in college that went around singing at churches, and I went around running sound at churches and preaching, because I don't sing well. And the first question we had to ask when we got to a church before we set up, can we move the communion table? Because you get to churches where you couldn't move it for even one service to set up things, and you just have to work around it. I thought, well, okay, but then I've seen churches like that, don't ever move the communion table, but then they miss the inner heart attitude of what's being represented here. What does Paul talk about Jesus coming to earth in his sacrifice? What's the key trait it demonstrates? Humility. He humbled himself to come to earth and die, even death on a cross. And so to value the outward symbol and action, but miss the inner spiritual quality, no, but it's so easy to do, isn't it? We've got this, churches, we've got this order of service. You can't mess with this order of service. Okay, but where's the heart? Is it there? I'm not saying you can't have both, but boy, I've seen where we just focus. I went there, I showed up at Sunday school, I showed up at Sunday morning, everything's great, and then where's the heart? We can all fall into this and not realize it, just like them. How is my humility when it comes to my awareness of my limitations to think, hey God, look how great I'm doing, and God's up there saying, I look at the heart. And then another one that came to mind, what about in terms of humility, aware of my limitations when it comes to man-made traditions and applications versus God's clear principles? We saw this back in Mark 7. Jesus said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." He's saying you've added things and you put more focus on that than you do God's commandments. As a matter of fact, you've gotten to the point where your attitude toward these things contradicts God's intentions with His clear commandments. We're probably familiar with the movie Footloose. It was all about you don't dance. Where does it say that? And what's the attitude of the people who are enforcing that? It's so easy, though. And here's the big problem with this one. As we talk about man-made applications, no one wants to think their application is man-made. Well, of course, this is just what you do. It's got to be that way. I've said before, I think churches need to really examine, some of them, the role of women in service. Keep that balance between men are the spiritual leaders of a church, but everyone is supposed to contribute. But we have trouble with that. Is what we know, is what we do, is it truly from God, or is it because we've always done it this way? Is it because I'd be real uncomfortable if we did it another way? Or Grandma would roll over in her grave if... I can remember my great-grandmother, who I love. I can also remember my parents. We were at some church family's house, and we played pool, and they told us, don't tell your great-grandmother you played pool. That was just an absolute no-no. What Bible verse is that from? There isn't one. I think it was just the fact that pool tables were found in pool halls, and pool halls were shady places, and so that made pool a bad thing. But there it is. To her, that was just, it was the 11th commandment, didn't make it on the tablets. And it's easy to do that for us as well. And so I tell you, we need to challenge this one. How sure are you when it comes to some of your applications? Because we've seen how serious this is. Jesus wouldn't repeat it over and over and over if it wasn't serious. It wouldn't be on par with love the Lord your God and love your neighbor if it wasn't serious. This is important. Am I exercising true humility, or do I not know what I don't know? And then the other side, in what areas am I lacking humility when it comes to putting others first? We've seen the effect on the disciples when they're like, hey, who's the greatest? I'll bet it's me. Jesus, can we sit at your right and left? And the others get indignant. And here's Bartimaeus. The man just wants to be healed, and here's the person who can do it just a few feet away. And the others are like, sit down and shut up. Not putting others first. Well, for us, Philippians 2, 3-8 is where this idea of humility comes from. It says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. And I've said the big problem with humility is we've come to misunderstand it. Being humble means what for most people? Not bragging. I'm humble, I don't brag. Don't make a big point of how good I really am. Or, some part of me, that's just scratching the surface. We've seen it's this awareness of my limitations and putting others first. Well, I think the same problem comes in what's it mean to put others first? I don't cut in line, I'm not pushy, I'm not like outwardly selfish. All right, I got this. Do you really think that's all it means? Look what Paul says as he goes on here. Have this mind. He goes on. I know you're going to struggle. Matter of fact, it's not just you. I know Satan's going to try to deceive you and think, okay, you're putting others first if you're not real pushy. Here's what true humility is. Verse 5, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, to be held on to and not let go of, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. How humble am I? How well do I put others first with that standard? That's true humility. That's true putting others first, to let go of everything that is literally my God-given right. And to suffer for people who don't deserve it to an extreme that isn't deserved, that's the standard. Okay, if that's what it means, how well do I do now? Versus, oh, well, I don't cut in line, I'm not pushy. That's our standard. How humble am I in light of that? Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. How well do I love myself based on how well I love my neighbor? Our actions toward other people, what are they? And not just our actions, but our attitude when we do them. People can tell if we do something to them with an attitude that isn't truly humble, that isn't truly loving. They know that. It does no good at all. It's even worse. God's goal, Christ's goal, is unity among believers. And that doesn't mean just no outward hostility. I've been in those churches too. but it means true unity, true love, true putting others first in every way. I would ask you, how well do you do with that? And not just on average, hey, in general I do well. Think of each person, each believer especially in this church and others you come in contact with. How well do I do of showing true love to each person? Of putting their interests before mine? Of being humble? John 17:20-21, Jesus talks about the reason for humility. He says, I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The reason for unity is because it impacts our witness for Christ. Humility underlies our unity. That's how important this is. And as we talk about, as a church growing, do you really think that God is going to bless any church that isn't truly united, that isn't truly humble, that doesn't have both sides of humility down? We put others first, starting with ourselves, and we're aware of our limitations. We don't do anything that, misses this point of the spiritual focus versus the physical. You think God's going to bless someone who doesn't, a church and people in our lives, if we don't have that? And it might be some element of, I don't know what I don't know. Well, it's time to find out, isn't it? It's time for that examination of self. Not always self-examination, because I can look at myself and say, I'm doing pretty good. But an examination of myself, which might include asking you, what do you see? Asking a close friend, a believer, maybe a non-believer, what do you see about me? I want to know. I don't want to miss anything. And that's the last question here, and you'll notice under what will I do now? There's nothing there. Guess who gets to fill in that? Yeah. What do we need to do? This is our last passage in the section on humility. We have seen that, I don't know if there's anything more important than this. Because again, humility underlies faith. We talk about you're saved by grace through faith. Well, faith is relying on God and surrendering to God. Well, humility is what makes me realize He's God, I'm not. I need to rely on Him. I need to surrender in Him. This is foundational. What do we need to do? Give me some ideas. How do we help recognize whether we have humility or not and grow in humility? I'll call on the first one who smiles.
We need to obey Him.
We need to obey Him. What if we think we are? Isn't that part of the problem with not recognizing it?
And we need to study it more.
We need to study it more. Trust Him more. What if we think we are?
Surrender more.
Surrender more. That one definitely comes. How do we know if we're surrendered? Isn't that the biggest problem with all this, is we don't know what we don't know? That's the one we got to get to the root of, isn't it? Tell you what I've noticed, if you ask God, that's my word for the year, is surrender. Like wishing I'd picked a different word.
If it's something I want to do, I have to take a step.
He'll show you. Yeah, he'll show you. If we're open, He'll show us. And that's it. And isn't that the essence of humility? Aware of my limitations. God, I may not be as trusting as I think, as surrendered as I think, as obedient as I think. Show me. And I really want to know. I'm not just saying it because it sounds good. God, show me. That's, I think, where it is. We re-sign our name to that blank sheet. God, you show me how obedient, how trusting, how surrendered I am.